The true part of the stomach in a ruminant is called the abomasum, which is right here. The long side of the abomasum is called the greater curvature. So the part of the omentum attaching to the greater curvature is the greater omentum. This inside, the shorter end of the abomasum, is called the lesser curvature. So likewise, the part of the omentum attaching to it is called the lesser omentum. So greater omentum here, lesser omentum here. The stomach has the fundus and the cardia towards the front end or the more cranial side. The caudal side has the pylorus. So this region of the stomach is called the pylorus. This part where it's going from the stomach into the small intestine up here is called the pyloric sphincter. So you can feel it, it's a sphincter muscle that's restricting movement of food from the stomach to the small intestine. So the first part of the small intestine is called the duodenum. This right here is the duodenum. The first structure to identify is the sigmoid loop of the duodenum, and it's right there. So it's the loop where the duodenum is going to come up and turn back around, and that's the sigmoid loop. It's important to identify because lying right behind it, this flat organ right here is the pancreas. So pancreas lies underneath the sigmoid loop of the duodenum. The duodenum is going to continue along, usually falls right beside the colon right there, and then it's going to transition into the second part of the small intestine, which is called the jejunum. So this right here is the jejunum. The jejunum is known for being this spiral, curly-cued stuff. It's where nutrients are absorbed in the food. So it takes a lot of space and a lot of time for that to happen. So it's the longest part of the small intestine, and it's able to get that length because it's really coiled. So if you straighten it out, it can be really long. This part that's holding it all together is called the mesentery. So it's the web that lies in between the jejunum. You can see it's got blood vessels and nerve supply. So the stomach is vascularized. So that's why you can have parts of the intestine that die. Or if you have a blockage in this intestine, it will restrict blood flow to the rest of the intestine. So mesentery is right here. Embedded in the mesentery are the mesenteric lymph nodes right there. So we talked about how the stomach has an immunological function. So if an animal has a bacteria that harbors in its stomach and it needs to respond to that, that comes from the lymph nodes that are embedded in the mesentery. So duodenum leads into the jejunum. The jejunum is going to go, part of our intestine is dying right there. The jejunum is going to transition into the final part of the small intestine, and that's called the ileum. So the ileum, it's really hard to tell where it starts, but you can usually tell that it ends when we go into the large intestine. So the first part of the large intestine up here is the cecum, and because of that, we know that this right here has to be the ileum. So the part going into the cecum or into the large intestine is called the ileum. So if we want you to identify the ileum, we'll tag right here, close to the cecum. This part lying between the cecum and the ileum is called the ileocecal fold. First part of the large intestine is the cecum right here. It's usually pretty bulky, and it's noticeable because it has this blind-ended pouch. So if you think about an animal as eating food and something can get stuck in this part of the cecum. So you heard of like appendicitis or colitis, things like that usually occurs right here. So the cecum is going to transition into the colon. So the colon has the ascending colon, the transverse colon, and the descending colon. The first part of the ascending colon is the proximal loop of the ascending colon. So the proximal loop is the big part, it's the bulky part. You'll notice that underneath it we have another loop of the ascending colon, and that's the distal, and we'll get to it here in a second. But the proximal is on top, and it's the bigger one. The proximal loop of the ascending colon is going to transition into the spiral colon. The part of the spiral colon going inward is called the centripetal coil. It's going to go all the way around until it folds on itself right here, and this is called the central flexure. It then transitions into the centrifugal coil, and will go out and exit the colon, or exit the spiral colon. This is usually where we see the formation of fecal balls. So they're small here, but they're there. So if you remember the large intestine, what's happening is no nutrients are being absorbed, but we are taking water and electrolytes out. So up here we had a really moist fecal content. And by the time it gets to here, all of the water and electrolytes are starting to come out. So you'll see the formation of fecal balls. They usually get pretty pronounced as you move towards the end. So the centrifugal coil is going to go all the way around, travel back up into right here, the proximal or the distal loop of the ascending colon. So it lies, this one's got a lot of fat, but it's a loop that lies right here. So it lies underneath the proximal loop. This is the distal loop of the ascending colon. So the ways that you can tell that you know that they're both parts of the ascending colon, the proximal's on top, no fecal balls. The distal's on the bottom and it has the fecal balls. It leaves the distal colon and goes across the body into the transverse colon. And we can't identify the transverse colon, we can't see it, so we won't ask you guys to identify it. It's going to shoot across the body, loop back around, and go into the descending colon right here. So the descending colon is the most dorsal part, or more towards the backbone, and it transitions into the rectum and the anus. We can't identify those structures in the goat, but they do make for good definition questions. So some organs, liver here, lying between the medial and quadrate lobes of the liver is the gallbladder.